The crimson sunset painted the vast Wyoming sky as Zara Sullivan clutched her infant daughter to her breast, blood seeping through her tattered dress. The sharp pain in her side reminded her with each labored breath that she was dying, abandoned on the desolate prairie after the stagecoach attack. Her husband's lifeless body lay several yards away, his dreams of California gold fields dying with him. As consciousness began to slip away, Zara heard the distant rumble of wagon wheels cutting through the silence of the open plain. Mason Reed pulled his team of horses to an abrupt halt when he spotted what appeared to be bodies scattered across the trail ahead. The tall, broad-shouldered cowboy had seen his share of death in his 30 years, but the sight still made his stomach turn. Bandits had been terrorizing this stretch between Cheyenne and Laramie for months. He reached for his Winchester rifle and cautiously approached. The first victim was clearly beyond help, a man with a bullet wound square in his chest. Mason moved on, scanning the area when a faint whimper caught his attention. There, partially hidden in the tall grass, lay a young woman. Her eyes were closed, face ashen beneath streaks of dirt and blood. But nestled against her chest was a tiny infant, alive and squirming. "Good Lord," Mason whispered, quickly kneeling beside them. He pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck, surprised to find a pulse, however faint. The baby, a girl no more than a few months old, began to wail. "Hang on, madam," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. "I'm going to get you both to safety." With gentle but urgent movements, Mason lifted the woman and child together, careful not to separate them. The woman was light in his arms, her body limp. The baby continued crying as he carried them to his wagon, laying them carefully on the bed of blankets in the back. "It's going to be all right, little one," he murmured to the infant, though he wasn't at all certain that was true. The nearest doctor was in Laramie, still a good 5 hours away if he pushed the horses hard. But one look at the pale face of the young mother told him she might not have 5 hours. Mason climbed onto the wagon seat and snapped the reins. "Hiya," he called to his team, turning them toward Laramie. Behind him, the baby's cries softened to whimpers. As the wagon jolted forward, Zara drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain in her side had become a distant throb, and a strange warmth seemed to envelop her despite the evening chill. She was vaguely aware of movement, of her baby's cries, and of a deep, soothing voice nearby. Death, she thought dimly, was gentler than she'd expected. The setting sun cast long shadows across the trail as Mason urged the horses faster. Every few minutes, he glanced back at his passengers. The woman hadn't moved, but her chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths. The baby had fallen asleep, tiny fists curled against her mother's blood-stained dress. "Just hold on," Mason whispered into the wind. "Just hold on." By the time the lights of Laramie appeared on the horizon, stars had begun to speckle the vast Wyoming sky. Mason's horses were lathered with sweat, their breathing labored from the punishing pace he'd set. The woman in the wagon had stirred once, moaning softly before falling silent again. Mason drove straight to Doc Wilson's house at the edge of town, the wagon wheels kicking up dust as he pulled to a stop. He leaped down and pounded on the door. Doc Wilson," he shouted. A light appeared in the window, and moments later the door swung open to reveal a gray-haired man in suspenders, a book still in his hand. "Mason Reed, what in tarnation, stagecoach attack," Mason interrupted. "Woman's badly hurt, has a baby with her." Doc Wilson's expression immediately sobered. "Bring her in. Sarah," he called over his shoulder to his wife. "Prepare the examination room." Mason hurried back to the wagon and carefully gathered the woman and child in his arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake as he carried them into the doctor's house. "Put her here," Doc directed, indicating a table covered with a clean sheet. "Sarah, take the child." As the doctor's wife gently separated the infant from her mother, the woman's eyes flew open, wild with panic. "My baby," she gasped, trying to sit up. "Please, my baby, she's safe, madam," Mason said quickly, stepping closer so she could see him. "Your little girl is right here, safe and sound." The woman's gaze locked with his for a moment, her eyes a startling shade of green before she collapsed back against the table, strength spent, gunshot wound to the side. Doc Wilson announced, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of her dress. Looks like it went clean through. She's lost a lot of blood. Will she live? Mason asked, his voice low. The doctor glanced up at him, then back at his patient. Can't say for certain, but she's made it this far. That shows she's a fighter. In the corner, Sarah Wilson was cleaning the baby with a warm cloth. Poor little thing, she murmured. She seems unharmed, just hungry and frightened. Mason found himself unable to leave. He should go stable his horses, find a room at the boarding house, continue his journey to his ranch in the morning. Instead, he sank into a chair in the doctor's parlor, hat in his hands, and waited. An hour passed, then two. The baby had been fed cow's milk from a bottle Sarah had fashioned and now slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle. From the examination room came the murmur of the doctor's voice and the occasional clinking of instruments. Finally, Doc Wilson emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. She'll live, he announced, though his expression remained grave. The bullet missed anything vital, but she's weak from blood loss and exposure. Fever's likely to set in by morning. Relief washed over Mason, stronger than he'd expected. What about the baby? Healthy as can be, surprisingly. Must have been shielded by her mother's body during whatever happened out there. The doctor studied Mason carefully. You know them, Mason shook his head. Found them on the trail about 5 hours back. Man was with them dead, looked like a bandit attack on a stagecoach. The Harmon gang, most likely, Doc Wilson said grimly. They've been hitting the stages between here and Cheyenne regular-like. Sheriff's been trying to track them for months. The woman say anything about who she is? Just asked for her baby before she passed out again. No identification on her that I could find. Mason nodded slowly, turning his hat in his hands. I'll go speak to the sheriff, let him know what happened. She'll need someone to look after her, Doc Wilson said, his tone meaningful. And that baby too, once the fever breaks. My Sarah can help for a day or two, but we're headed to Denver next week for our daughter's wedding. Mason hesitated. He had responsibilities at his ranch, cattle that needed tending, fences that needed mending, hired hands waiting for his return. He'd only come to Cheyenne for supplies, never intending to get involved in something like this. I can pay for a room at the boarding house, he said finally, and a nurse to tend to them until she's well enough to tell us where she's headed. Doc Wilson smiled slightly. That's mighty generous, Mason. Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Seems like the Christian thing to do. You can see her if you'd like before you go. She's sleeping now, but comfortable as can be made. Mason nodded and followed the doctor back to the examination room. The woman lay still on the table, now covered with a clean blanket. Her dark hair had been washed and spread out on the pillow beneath her head. With the dirt and blood gone, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25 or so. Her face, though pale, was lovely. I'll be back in the morning, Mason said, more to himself than to the doctor. After I've spoken with the sheriff. But as he turned to leave, her eyes fluttered open again. Those striking green eyes focused on his face with surprising clarity. You saved us, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mason moved closer to the table. Just happened upon you, madam. Anyone would have done the same. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, but it was you. Her eyelids began to droop. Thank you, Mason, he supplied. Mason Reed. Zara, she murmured as sleep reclaimed her. Zara Sullivan. The name echoed in Mason's mind as he left the doctor's house and walked the quiet streets of Laramie to the sheriff's office. Zara Sullivan. Somehow, knowing her name made what had happened feel more real and his involvement more personal. Sheriff Thomas was still at his desk despite the late hour, a lamp burning as he pored over wanted posters. He looked up when Mason entered, recognition dawning on his weathered face. Mason Reed. Didn't know you were in town. Just passing through, Mason replied, taking a seat across from the lawman, but I came across something on the trail you should know about. He relayed the events of the evening, finding the bodies, rescuing Zara and her baby, bringing them to Doc Wilson. With each detail, the sheriff's expression grew grimmer. That'd be the Harmon gang, sure enough, he confirmed when Mason had finished. Third stagecoach they've hit this month. Did the woman Zara, you said, mention anything about what happened, how many men there were? Whether they took anything besides lives, Mason shook his head. She's barely conscious. All I know is her name and that she has an infant daughter. Sheriff Thomas sighed heavily. Well, I'll ride out at first light, see if there are any other survivors, gather what evidence I can. These Harmon boys are getting bolder. Time was they just robbed the passengers and let them continue on. Now they're leaving no witnesses. Except Zara, Mason pointed out. Except her, the sheriff agreed, which means she might be in danger if they realize someone survived to identify them. The thought sent a chill down Mason's spine. You think they'd come after her, here in town? Can't say for certain, but I wouldn't dismiss the possibility. Sheriff Thomas leaned back in his chair. Might be safer if folks don't know who she is or what she saw, at least until we track down the Harmon gang. Mason nodded slowly, already formulating a plan. I've arranged for her to stay at the boarding house once Doc says she's stable enough to move. I'll make sure word doesn't spread about how she came to be here. The sheriff studied him curiously. That's mighty concerned of you for a woman you just met. Mason shifted uncomfortably. Like I told Doc Wilson, it's the Christian thing to do. Sheriff Thomas's mustache twitched. Well, I won't argue with Christian charity. Let me know if she remembers anything that might help us catch these killers. Mason left the sheriff's office with a heavier heart than when he'd entered. The thought of Zara and her baby being in continued danger hadn't occurred to him until now. His plan to pay for their care and continue on his way suddenly seemed inadequate. He found a room at the Laramie Inn for the night, but sleep eluded him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Zara's pale face, heard the baby's cries. By dawn, he'd made his decision. After a quick breakfast, Mason returned to Doc Wilson's house. The doctor looked tired but satisfied when he opened the door. She made it through the night, he announced before Mason could ask. Fever's there, but not as bad as I feared it might be. She's strong, that one. And the baby. Slept like a lamb after her feeding. Sarah's got her now. Mason nodded, relieved. Can I see them? Doc Wilson led him to the back room, where Zara lay on a proper bed now, a cool cloth on her forehead. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, but her breathing seemed steadier than the night before. In a chair beside the bed, Sarah Wilson sat rocking the infant, who was awake and looking around with curious eyes. Look who's here, Sarah said softly to the baby. The man who saved you and your mama. Mason removed his hat as he approached, suddenly feeling awkward. How is she? He asked, nodding toward Zara. Resting comfortably, Sarah replied. She woke earlier, asked about the baby, seemed relieved when I told her the little one was fine. She tilted the infant so Mason could see her better. She's a beautiful child, can't be more than 3 months old. Mason found himself smiling at the baby, who regarded him solemnly with eyes the same striking green as her mother's. What's her name? Zara hasn't said, Sarah admitted. I've just been calling her little one. Hope. The whispered word drew their attention to the bed, where Zara's eyes were now open, watching them. Her name is Hope, Zara said, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. Hope Elizabeth Sullivan. A beautiful name, Sarah said, bringing the baby closer so Zara could see her. And fitting, I think. Zara's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter, then shifted her gaze to Mason. You're still here, she said, sounding surprised. Wanted to make sure you were both all right, he replied, twisting his hat in his hands. A small smile touched her lips. Thanks to you, we are. Doc Wilson entered then, checking Zara's pulse and feeling her forehead with a practiced hand. Fever's not climbing, that's a good sign. How's the pain? Manageable, Zara answered, though the tightness around her eyes suggested otherwise. I'll fix you some willow bark tea, Sarah offered, standing with the baby still in her arms. It'll help with both the fever and the pain. As Sarah left the room, Doc Wilson followed, leaving Mason alone with Zara. For a moment, neither spoke. Sheriff Thomas is riding out to the attack site this morning, Mason finally said. He'll see if there's anything to be recovered from the stagecoach. Your belongings, perhaps, Zara's expression clouded. Everything we had was in those trunks, not that it was much, her voice caught. David, my husband, he was taking us to California, said there were opportunities there. Mason nodded, uncertain what to say. The loss of her husband was still too fresh for mere condolences. The sheriff also thinks, he continued carefully, that it might be safer if people don't know exactly how you came to be in Laramie. The men who attacked the stagecoach, they're known outlaws. The Harmon gang, if they learned someone survived who might identify them. Understanding dawned in Zara's eyes, followed by fear. They'd come after me, after Hope. It's just a precaution, Mason assured her. Sheriff's been trying to catch these men for months. Maybe he'll find them before you're even well enough to leave Doc Wilson's care. Zara closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. And if he doesn't, what then? I have no money, no family here. David was taking us to his brother in Sacramento. The words Mason spoke next surprised even him. I have a ranch about 20 miles north of here. It's not much, but there's a small cabin on the property where you and Hope could stay until you're fully recovered. No one would look for you there. Zara's eyes widened. You do that for strangers? Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Like I said, it's not much, but it's safe. And my sister Millicent lives in the main house with me. She'd be glad for the female company, I expect. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous from a man she'd just met. Mason could see the wariness in her eyes, the natural caution of a woman alone in the world with a child to protect. You don't have to decide now, he added quickly. But the offer stands when you're well enough to travel. Zara nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Reed, I'll consider it. Mason, he corrected. Just Mason is fine. A small smile touched her lips. Mason, she repeated softly. Sarah returned with the promised tea, and Mason took that as his cue to leave. I'll be in town for a few more days, he told Zara, getting supplies and such. I'll check in on you tomorrow if that's all right. I'd like that, Zara replied, and something in her voice made his heart beat a little faster. Outside, the morning sun had risen fully over the buildings of Laramie. Mason stood on the doctor's porch for a moment, wondering what had possessed him to offer his ranch as sanctuary to a woman he barely knew. It wasn't like him to act on impulse. He was known throughout the county as a deliberate, cautious man. Yet there was something about Zara Sullivan that had gotten under his skin from the moment he'd found her on that trail, clutching her baby even as her own life ebbed away. There was courage there, and a fierce will to live that matched his own. Over the next 3 days, Mason divided his time between gathering the supplies he'd originally come to town for and visiting Zara and Hope at Doc Wilson's house. Each day, Zara grew stronger. The fever broke on the 2nd day, and by the 3rd, she was sitting up in bed, holding Hope and even taking a few careful steps around the room. With each visit, Mason learned more about her. She'd grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher. She'd met David Sullivan at a church social 2 years earlier, and they'd married within 6 months. Hope had been born in April of 1876, just 4 months ago. David had worked as a clerk in a mercantile store but had dreams of striking it rich in California. They'd sold everything they owned to purchase stagecoach tickets west. In turn, Mason told her about his ranch, the 100 head of cattle, the vegetable garden his sister Millicent tended, the apple orchard that was just beginning to produce fruit. He didn't mention the years of backbreaking work it had taken to make the land productive, or the crushing loneliness of the first winters after his parents had died of influenza, leaving him and Millicent to manage alone. On the 4th day, Doc Wilson declared Zara well enough to leave his care, though she would need to continue changing the bandage on her wound and taking it easy for at least another week. No lifting anything heavier than that baby, he instructed, his tone brooking no argument. And no riding horseback or bouncing around in wagons any more than necessary. Yes, doctor, Zara agreed meekly, though there was a twinkle in her eye that suggested she might not be quite so obedient once out of his sight. Sheriff Thomas had returned from the attack site with grim news. 4 passengers and the driver had been killed. The stagecoach had been ransacked, trunks broken open, and valuables taken. He'd recovered a few personal items, including a locket with a tiny portrait of a man inside that Zara identified as David, but nothing of significant value. Did you remember anything else about the attack? He asked Zara carefully. How many men there were, what they looked like. Zara shook her head, her expression haunted. It happened so fast. There were shots, the stage stopped. David pushed me down to the floor, covered me with his body. I heard more shots, shouting. She swallowed hard. I remember being dragged from the stage. I was holding hope. Someone hit me here. She touched her temple, where a fading bruise was still visible. Then there was pain in my side, and I was on the ground, I think. I think they thought I was already dead. Sheriff Thomas nodded sympathetically. That fits with what we know of the Harmon gang. They don't usually bother checking their victims too carefully. Their mistake, Mason said softly, his hand finding Zara's and squeezing gently, and our good fortune. The sheriff looked between them, a knowing glint in his eye. Mason tells me you'll be staying at his ranch while you recover, Mrs. Sullivan. That seems wise. I'll let you know if we make any progress catching these outlaws. After he left, Zara turned to Mason, her expression uncertain. Are you sure about this? Taking us in? I don't want to be a burden. You won't be, Mason assured her. The cabin is just sitting empty, and like I said, Millicent will be glad for the company. She gets tired of just having me to talk to. Zara smiled, the expression transforming her face. Well then, for Millicent's sake, we accept. The next morning, Mason brought his wagon to Doc Wilson's house. He'd padded the back with extra blankets and pillows to make the journey as comfortable as possible for Zara and Hope. Sarah Wilson had provided them with some basic necessities: diapers for the baby, a change of clothes for Zara that she'd hastily altered to fit, and a small basket of food. You take care now, Sarah said, embracing Zara carefully. And don't you worry about paying the doctor. Mason's taken care of everything. Zara's surprised gaze flew to Mason, who was suddenly very busy checking the harness on his horses. Ready when you are, he called over his shoulder, not meeting her eyes. With Sarah's help, Zara climbed into the wagon bed, settling among the blankets with Hope in her arms. The baby was alert, her green eyes taking in the bright morning sunshine with apparent delight. All set? Mason asked, climbing onto the driver's seat. All set, Zara confirmed, trying to ignore the pain in her side as the wagon began to move. 20 miles wasn't so far, she told herself, and at the end of it waited safety, at least for a while. As they left the town behind, Zara found herself studying the back of Mason's broad shoulders. He was a mystery to her, this taciturn cowboy who had saved her life and now offered his home as sanctuary. In the 4 days she'd known him, he'd shown nothing but kindness and respect, asking for nothing in return. Men like that were rare in her experience. David had been good to her in his way, but he'd been driven by ambition, always looking toward the horizon, never quite content with what they had. Mason seemed different, rooted, steady, a man at peace with his place in the world. The journey took most of the day, with frequent stops for Zara to nurse Hope or for Mason to check that his passengers were comfortable. By late afternoon, the wagon crested a rise and Mason pulled the horses to a halt. There it is, he said, gesturing ahead. Reed Ranch. Zara struggled to sit up, wincing at the pull on her stitches. What she saw took her breath away. Below them stretched a verdant valley, bisected by a winding creek. A neat white farmhouse stood near a cluster of outbuildings with corrals and pastures spreading outward. In the distance, cattle grazed on the lush summer grass. A small cabin sat a little apart from the main house, surrounded by young apple trees. It's beautiful, Zara breathed. Mason looked pleased. Been in my family for 20 years now. My pa staked his claim when I was just 10 years old. Built that main house with his own 2 hands. There was pride in his voice, and something else, a deep connection to the land that Zara found herself envying. She'd never had a real home, not since leaving her father's house to marry David. They'd lived in rented rooms, always temporary, always waiting for the next move. As they approached the farmhouse, a slender woman with dark hair appeared on the porch, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. When she recognized the wagon, she hurried down the steps, a wide smile on her face. Mason, you're back earlier than I expected, she called, then stopped short when she noticed Zara and the baby in the wagon bed. Oh, you've brought guests. Mason jumped down from the wagon seat and embraced his sister briefly. "Millicent, this is Mrs. Zara Sullivan and her daughter, Hope. They'll be staying in the old cabin for a while." He lowered his voice, though not enough that Zara couldn't hear. "I'll explain everything later." Millicent's eyes widened with curiosity, but she immediately moved to the back of the wagon. "Welcome to Reed Ranch, Mrs. Sullivan. You look exhausted, you poor thing. Let's get you and the little one settled right away." Between Mason and Millicent, Zara was helped from the wagon and escorted to the small cabin. Though it had clearly been unused for some time, it was clean and sturdy, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a table with chairs, and a curtained-off sleeping alcove containing a narrow bed. "It's not much," Mason said, echoing his words from days earlier, "but it's private and safe." "It's perfect," Zara assured him, sinking gratefully onto a chair while still holding Hope. "Thank you both so much. I'll get a fire going," Millicent offered. "The nights can be chilly, even in summer, and I'll bring over some supper from the main house once it's ready. You just rest." As Millicent busied herself with the fireplace, Mason brought in Zara's few belongings from the wagon. "I'll fetch water from the well," he said. "And there's a wash basin behind that screen in the corner. The outhouse is just behind the cabin." Zara nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. Tears pricked at her eyes and she blinked rapidly to clear them. Mason noticed and awkwardly patted her shoulder. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "You and Hope both. Take all the time you need to heal." After he left, Millicent straightened from the now crackling fire and turned to Zara with a warm smile. "My brother didn't tell me much in his telegram, just that he was bringing a woman and child who needed a place to stay, but I can see you've been through an ordeal." Zara hesitated, unsure how much Mason wanted his sister to know. "Your brother saved our lives," she said finally. "I'm not sure what would have happened if he hadn't found us when he did." Millicent nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation for now. "Mason has a good heart, though he doesn't always show it. He's been looking after me since our parents died 10 years ago." She smiled wistfully. "Sometimes I think he's forgotten there's more to life than responsibility and hard work." Before Zara could respond, Hope began to fuss, her little face scrunching up in preparation for a full-throated cry. "She's probably hungry," Zara said, adjusting the baby in her arms. "And tired from the journey." "I'll leave you to feed her in peace," Millicent said, heading for the door, "but I'll be back with supper in about an hour, and I'll bring some fresh milk for you both." Left alone, Zara undid the buttons of her borrowed dress and guided Hope to her breast. As the baby nursed contentedly, Zara gazed around the small cabin that would be their home for. How long? She hadn't discussed that with Mason. A few weeks until she was fully healed, and then what? The future stretched before her, vast and uncertain as the Wyoming prairie. She had no money, no skills beyond basic housekeeping, and nowhere to go. The thought of continuing to Sacramento to find David's brother held little appeal. She'd never met the man, and he might not welcome the responsibility of a widowed sister-in-law and infant niece. For now, though, they were safe. It would have to be enough. True to her word, Millicent returned an hour later with a tray laden with food, savory beef stew, fresh biscuits, a jar of preserves, and a pitcher of milk. She'd also brought a basin of warm water and some clean cloths. "I thought you might want to freshen up," she explained, setting everything on the table. "And I found some of my old nightgowns that should fit you better than what you're wearing. The sleeves might be a bit short, you're taller than me, but they'll do for now." Zara was touched by the thoughtfulness. "You're very kind, both of you." Millicent waved away the thanks. "It's nice having another woman around. This place can get mighty lonely, especially in winter when the snow makes travel difficult." She hesitated, then added, "Mason told me a little about what happened, about the stagecoach attack. I'm so sorry about your husband." Zara nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, it still doesn't seem real somehow. Grief is like that," Millicent said softly. "When our mother died, I kept expecting to see her in the kitchen every morning for months afterward." She reached across the table and squeezed Zara's hand. "It does get easier, though never easy." After Millicent left, Zara managed to eat a little of the stew and feed Hope again before exhaustion overtook her. She washed herself as best she could with the basin of water, changed into one of Millicent's nightgowns, and crawled into the narrow bed with Hope beside her. Despite the strangeness of her surroundings, sleep claimed her almost immediately. She woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she was disoriented, then memory flooded back. She was at Reed Ranch in the small cabin Mason had offered as sanctuary. Hope was still sleeping peacefully beside her, tiny fists curled near her face. Zara watched her daughter breathe for a moment, overwhelmed with love and gratitude that they had both survived. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Quickly checking that she was decently covered in the borrowed nightgown, Zara called, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Mason, a steaming mug in one hand and a basket in the other. "Good morning," he said, his voice gruff. "Thought you might want some coffee, and Millicent sent breakfast." Zara sat up carefully, mindful of her wound, and pushed her tangled hair back from her face. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful." Mason set the coffee and basket on the table, then stood awkwardly near the door, hat in hand. "I'll be working with the cattle today, but Millicent will be around if you need anything. She's in the garden most mornings." Zara nodded, struck by how different he looked in the morning light, less the heroic rescuer and more a man uncomfortable in his own skin. "We'll be fine." "Hope and I will probably just rest today." Mason nodded, apparently relieved to be dismissed. "Well then, I'll see you this evening." After he left, Zara sipped the strong coffee gratefully and investigated the basket Millicent had sent. It contained fresh bread, a jar of honey, some hard-boiled eggs, and a small pot of what appeared to be porridge. As Zara ate, she found herself thinking about Mason Reed. There was something compelling about him, a quiet strength, a steadiness that she found reassuring. And though he often seemed uncomfortable in conversation, his actions spoke volumes about his character. Days slipped into a gentle routine at Reed Ranch. Each morning, Mason would bring coffee and exchange a few words before heading out to work with his cattle or mend fences. Millicent would visit later, usually bearing food or clean laundry, and would sit with Zara for an hour or so, chatting about everything from recipes to the latest book she'd ordered from back east. In the evenings, Mason would return, often bringing a small gift, a bunch of wildflowers, a wooden toy he'd carved for Hope, once even a book of poetry that he'd ridden all the way to Laramie to purchase when Zara mentioned missing her father's library. A week passed, then two. Zara's wound healed cleanly, the pain fading to an occasional twinge. Hope thrived in the clean mountain air, growing plumper and more alert by the day. She smiled now, real smiles, not just reflexive ones, and the first time it happened, Zara wished desperately that Mason had been there to see it instead of out with his cattle. The thought surprised her. When had Mason's opinion become so important? One evening in late August, nearly a month after they'd arrived at Reed Ranch, Zara sat on the small porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Hope was asleep inside, and Zara had taken advantage of the rare moment of solitude to simply breathe and think. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Mason was walking toward the cabin, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He'd clearly just washed up after a day's work. His hair was damp and he wore a clean shirt. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space beside her on the porch step. "Please do," Zara replied, moving over slightly to make room. Mason sat down, stretching his long legs out before him. For a while, they watched the sunset in companionable silence. "Hope sleeping?" he finally asked. Zara nodded. "She's been awake most of the day. I think she's starting to teethe. She's been fussy and drooling more than usual." Mason smiled slightly. "Millicent was the same way, according to our mother, cried for 3 days straight when her first tooth came in." The mention of Millicent as a baby reminded Zara of something she'd been curious about. "You raised her after your parents died, didn't you? She told me a little about it." Mason nodded, his expression growing somber. "She was 12 when the influenza took them both, one right after the other. I was 22, just getting started helping Pa run the ranch. Suddenly I was responsible for everything: the cattle, the land, a grieving sister." "That must have been hard," Zara said softly. Mason shrugged. We managed. Millicent grew up fast, too fast, maybe. She took over the household while I focused on the ranch. Between us, we kept things going. You never thought of marrying, having someone to share the burden. The question slipped out before Zara could stop it, and she immediately felt heat rise to her cheeks. It was too personal, too forward. But Mason didn't seem offended. Thought about it, he admitted. There were a few girls in Laramie who might have said yes if I'd asked, but none of them seemed. He trailed off, searching for the right word. Right, Zara suggested. Mason nodded, his gaze still on the horizon. Right. He turned to look at her then, his eyes reflecting the last golden light of the setting sun. What about you? Will you go to Sacramento to your husband's brother? Zara sighed, the question bringing her back to the reality of her situation. I don't know. I have his address, but I've never met him. And I have no money for the journey. She twisted her hands in her lap. I should start looking for work in Laramie, I suppose. I could teach or take in sewing. Mason was quiet for a long moment. There's no rush, he finally said. You and Hope are welcome here as long as you need to stay. Zara felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by his generosity. You've already done so much for us. I can't keep imposing. It's not an imposition, Mason interrupted, his voice firm. Having you here, both of you, it's been. He paused, seemingly at a loss for words. Been what? Zara prompted, her heart suddenly beating faster. Mason turned to face her fully, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. It's been like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night, he said softly. Something I didn't know I was missing until it was there. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Zara felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. Mason, she began, but was interrupted by Hope's cry from inside the cabin. The moment broke. Mason stood quickly, offering Zara his hand to help her up. You should see to her, he said, his voice returning to its usual gruff tone. I'll say good night. Zara took his hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. For a brief second, they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the clean scent of soap on his skin. Then he released her hand and stepped back. Good night, Mason, she said softly, and thank you for everything. He nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the main house, his figure gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness. Inside the cabin, Zara lifted Hope from her makeshift cradle and held her close, swaying gently to soothe the fussing infant. Her mind was a whirl of confused emotions. Was she imagining the connection she felt with Mason? Was it merely gratitude on her part, or perhaps loneliness on his? And even if it was something more, was she ready? David had been dead barely a month. The wound of his loss was still fresh, the grief still raw at unexpected moments. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach when Mason looked at her with those intent blue eyes, or the way her day seemed brighter when he was near. It was too soon, she told herself firmly. Too soon for such feelings, too soon to even name them. But as she settled Hope back to sleep, Zara found herself wondering what might happen if she stayed at Reed Ranch not just until she was healed, but longer. Much longer. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color to the aspens on the hillsides. Zara's wound had healed completely, leaving only a puckered scar as a reminder of how close she'd come to death. Hope had cut her first tooth and was now attempting to crawl, much to everyone's delight and consternation. She'll be into everything before you know it, Millicent warned one afternoon as they watched Hope scoot backward across the cabin floor, frustration evident on her tiny face as she tried to move forward instead. We should make sure this place is secure for a mobile baby. The casual "we" didn't escape Zara's notice. Over the past weeks, both Reed's siblings had begun to speak as though Zara and Hope's presence at the ranch was a permanent arrangement rather than a temporary solution. And if Zara was honest with herself, the thought of leaving grew more painful with each passing day. She'd come to love the rhythm of life at Reed Ranch, the misty mornings, the industrious days, the peaceful evenings. She'd come to rely on Millicent's friendship and practical advice. And she'd come to look forward to those quiet moments with Mason, when the day's work was done and they could simply sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes not. There had been no more declarations like the one that sunset evening, but something had shifted between them. Mason sought her company more openly now, finding reasons to stop by the cabin throughout the day. He'd taken to reading aloud in the evenings, first from the book of poetry he'd bought her, then from a volume of Shakespeare's plays that had belonged to his mother. Zara, in turn, had begun cooking meals for him and Millicent, insisting it was the least she could do to repay their hospitality. She'd also started helping with the household laundry and the vegetable garden, ignoring Millicent's protests that she was a guest, not a servant. "I need to feel useful," Zara had explained, "and I enjoy it, truly." The truth was, she enjoyed feeling part of something again, part of a household, part of a family, even if it wasn't truly her own. One crisp morning in late September, Zara was hanging laundry on the line stretched between the cabin and a nearby tree when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Looking up, she saw Sheriff Thomas riding toward the ranch, accompanied by another man she didn't recognize. Her heart raced with sudden fear. Had the Harmon gang been captured? Would she be asked to identify them? Or worse, had they somehow learned of her survival and sent someone to silence her? Mason emerged from the barn, apparently having heard the horses as well. He spoke briefly with the sheriff, then both men dismounted and headed toward the cabin, Mason leading the way with quick, purposeful strides. "Zara," he called as they approached. "Sheriff Thomas is here, he has news." Setting down her laundry basket, Zara straightened her skirts and moved to meet them, trying to calm her racing pulse. "Mrs. Sullivan," the sheriff greeted her, tipping his hat. "Good to see you looking so well. This is Deputy Wilson." The deputy nodded politely, his young face solemn. "What's happened?" Zara asked, looking between the lawman and Mason. "Have you caught them, the men who attacked the stagecoach?" Sheriff Thomas shook his head. "Not exactly, madam, but there's been a development." He glanced at Mason, then back to Zara. "Perhaps we should sit down." Mason led them all to the cabin porch, where Zara perched anxiously on the top step while the men remained standing. "3 days ago," Sheriff Thomas began, "the Harmon gang hit another stagecoach, this one coming from Denver, but something went wrong. Passengers were armed, and in the exchange of gunfire, 2 of the gang were killed. One of them was Jake Harmon himself," Deputy Wilson added. "The leader," Zara's breath caught, "and the others escaped," Sheriff Thomas said grimly. "But with Jake dead, the gang's likely to fall apart. These types always do when they lose their ringleader." "So they won't be coming after Mrs. Sullivan?" Mason asked, his voice tight with concern. Sheriff Thomas shook his head. "Unlikely. With Jake dead and the others scattered, they'll be more concerned with saving their own skins than settling old scores." Relief washed over Zara so powerfully that she felt light-headed. "So it's over, we're safe." "I believe so, madam," the sheriff confirmed. "Of course you should still exercise caution, there are always desperate men in these parts. But the specific threat from the Harmon gang, yes, I think that's past." Mason's hand came to rest on Zara's shoulder, a warm, steadying presence. "Thank you for bringing us this news, Sheriff." "Will you stay for some coffee?" Sheriff Thomas smiled but shook his head. "We should be getting back to town. Just wanted to let you know as soon as possible, figured you'd sleep easier." After the lawman had ridden away, Zara remained on the porch, trying to process what this news meant. The immediate danger was gone. She and Hope were safe, truly safe, not just hidden away. Mason sat down beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers. "You're free now," he said quietly. "Free to go to Sacramento or wherever else you might want to go." Zara turned to look at him, trying to read his expression. "Is that what you want, for us to leave?" Mason's eyes widened. "God, no," he said with unexpected vehemence. "That's the last thing I want." The admission hung between them, weighty with implication. Zara felt her heart begin to race again, but for an entirely different reason than before. "What do you want, Mason?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked away, out across the ranch that had been his whole world for so long. "I want you to stay," he said finally, the words seeming to be pulled from somewhere deep inside him. "Both of you, not as guests, not temporarily." He turned back to her, his blue eyes intense. "Permanently, as family," Zara's breath caught. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Mason ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly uncertain. I'm making a mess of this, aren't I? I had it all planned what I would say, how I would ask, proper like with a ring and everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. I've been carrying this around for a week, waiting for the right moment. He opened the pouch and tipped a delicate gold ring with a small pearl into his palm. It was my mother's, he explained. Pa gave it to her when they decided to come west together. Zara stared at the ring, her heart hammering in her chest. Mason, I know it's too soon, he interrupted, closing his hand around the ring. David's only been gone a few months, and maybe you don't feel for me what I feel for you. I would understand that. What do you feel for me? Zara asked, needing to hear the words. Mason met her gaze steadily. I love you, he said simply. I think I began falling in love with you that first night when you opened your eyes and asked about hope before yourself. I've never known anyone with such courage, such strength. He paused, swallowing hard. I love Hope too. I want to be a father to her, to watch her grow, to teach her about this land that would be her inheritance. Tears filled Zara's eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. Oh, Mason, his face fell. I'm sorry, I've upset you. Please forget I said anything. No, Zara interrupted, reaching for his hand. No, don't take it back. I'm crying because... She took a deep breath, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in her heart. Because I think I love you too. And I feel guilty for it, because David is barely cold in his grave. And I'm afraid because loving someone means risking loss, and I've lost so much already. Mason's hand tightened around hers. I can't promise we won't face hardships, he said quietly. Life in Wyoming territory isn't easy even in the best of times. But I can promise that you'll never face those hardships alone, not while I have breath in my body. Zara looked into his earnest face and felt something settle in her soul, a certainty that had been building since that first night when he'd carried her and hope from the blood-soaked trail to safety. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Mason Reed, I will marry you. Joy transformed his features, making him look younger, almost boyish. You will, Zara nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. I will, but not right away. I need a little more time to say goodbye to what was before I can fully embrace what will be. Can you understand that? Of course, Mason said immediately. We can wait as long as you need. Spring, maybe, when the wildflowers bloom on the hillsides. Spring would be perfect, Zara agreed, squeezing his hand. And in the meantime, Hope and I will stay here if that's all right. We'll be part of this ranch, this family, even before it's official. Mason's answer was to slip his mother's ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her. Welcome home, Zara Sullivan, he whispered, and leaned forward to kiss her gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded, her arms circling his neck. They were interrupted by Hope's cry from inside the cabin. Breaking apart, they both laughed, a little breathless. Duty calls, Zara said, rising to her feet. Mason stood as well, but caught her hand before she could go inside. I'll come with you, he said, if that's all right. The request was simple, but Zara understood its significance. This wasn't just about the moment, it was about all the moments to come. About building a life together, day by day, choice by choice. That's more than all right, she replied, and led him into the cabin, into their future. Spring came to Wyoming territory in a riot of wildflowers and new green grass. The creek that ran through Reed Ranch swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, and birds returned to nest in the cottonwoods along its banks. In the small apple orchard, blossoms turned the trees into clouds of pink and white. On a perfect May morning, with the sky a flawless blue overhead, Zara Sullivan became Zara Reed in a simple ceremony held in the front yard of the ranch house. Reverend Parker had ridden out from Laramie to perform the service, and a handful of neighbors had gathered to witness the occasion. Zara wore a new dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her dark hair. Hope, now 9 months old and able to stand with assistance, watched from Millicent's arms, dressed in a tiny white gown that Millicent had sewn for the occasion. As Zara spoke her vows, her voice clear and sure in the spring air, she thought of all that had brought her to this moment, the tragedy that had nearly taken her life, the kindness of the man who had saved her, the slow healing of body and spirit that had allowed her to open her heart to love again. When Mason slipped the gold band onto her finger to join his mother's pearl ring, his hands were steady, his eyes full of a love so profound it took Zara's breath away. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Parker declared, beaming at the couple. "Mason, you may kiss your bride." Mason pulled Zara close, his kiss a promise of all the years to come. Around them, their small gathering of guests applauded, and Hope squealed in delight, reaching out for her mother and new father. The celebration that followed was simple, but joyous, a feast prepared by Millicent and the neighboring women, music provided by old Mr. Lawson on his fiddle, dancing on the packed earth of the yard until the stars came out. Later, after the guests had departed and Hope had been settled to sleep in Millicent's room for the night, Mason led Zara to the main house, to what would now be their bedroom. "Are you happy, Mrs. Reed?" he asked softly, drawing her into his arms. Zara looked up at him, at this man who had become her shelter, her strength, her home. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. "When you found us on that trail, I was certain my life was ending. I never imagined it was just beginning." Mason brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "I thank God every day that I happened along when I did, that I found you both." "It wasn't chance," Zara said, believing it with all her heart. "It was providence." As Mason's lips found hers again, as they began the intimate dance of new husband and wife, Zara surrendered herself fully to the love that had rescued her from death's door and given her a second chance at life. Outside, the Wyoming night wrapped itself around Reed Ranch like a protective cloak. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound floating on the gentle spring breeze. And in the room where a new family was being forged in love's tender fire, the future stretched out like the vast prairie, wild, beautiful, and full of promise. 10 years later, on a golden autumn afternoon, Zara Reed stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching her children play in the yard. Hope, now 10 years old, was showing her 7-year-old brother Matthew how to twirl a lasso, while 5-year-old twins Sarah and Samuel chased each other around the apple trees, their laughter carried on the crisp air. "Careful with that rope, Hope," Zara called, though she knew her eldest was more than capable. Hope had grown into a confident, capable girl with her mother's green eyes and a natural affinity for ranch life that made Mason burst with pride. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Zara's attention to the path leading from the pastures. Mason appeared on his favorite gelding, silhouetted against the setting sun just as he had been the first time he'd approached her cabin all those years ago. The sight still made her heart beat faster. As he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, the children abandoned their games and ran to him, clamoring for attention. Mason scooped up the twins, one in each arm, while Hope and Matthew danced around him, eager to tell him about their day. Watching them, Zara felt a fullness in her heart that sometimes still surprised her. The life they had built together was richer, deeper, more joyful than anything she could have imagined on that terrible day when she'd lain bleeding on the trail, certain death was upon her. Mason looked up and caught her watching him. Over the heads of their children, their eyes met in a gaze of perfect understanding and enduring love. He set the twins down and made his way to the porch, the children trailing behind him like ducklings. "Hello, wife," he said, the familiar greeting still carrying a note of wonder, as though he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "Hello, husband," Zara replied, stepping into his embrace. His arms around her felt like coming home, as they always had. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Reed family gathered on the porch of the home they had built together, a sanctuary carved from wilderness, a legacy born of love and courage. And as Mason pressed a kiss to Zara's temple, she thought of the long journey that had brought them here, from death's door to life's fullest measure, from strangers to beloved companions, from tragedy to triumph. "What are you thinking about?" Mason murmured against her hair. Zara smiled, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one." Mason's arms tightened around her. "And ours is the best story of all," he said with quiet certainty. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Zara could only agree. Their story begun in blood and grief, transformed by compassion and courage, fulfilled in love and family, was indeed the best story of all. And it was still being written day by day, moment by moment, heartbeat by heartbeat. Together,